The morning sun cast long shadows across the charred remains of Tombstone's eastern district as cowboy Ethan Lone Wolf Carter guided his horse, Thunder, through the devastation. The fire had swept through 3 days ago, leaving behind a graveyard of blackened timber and shattered dreams. At 44, Ethan had seen his share of destruction, but something about this scene gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." "Whoa, boy," he murmured, dismounting near what had once been the schoolhouse. Thunder snorted nervously, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The horse had always been sensitive to trouble, and right now every muscle in his body was tense with unease. Ethan pulled his weathered hat lower against the glare and stepped carefully through the debris. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixed with something else, something that made his stomach turn. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were screaming that this wasn't just another tragic accident. "You shouldn't be here, stranger." The voice came from behind him, gravelly and unwelcoming. Ethan turned slowly to see Sheriff Marcus Brennan approaching, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. A big man with cold blue eyes and a permanent scowl, Brennan had the look of someone who'd forgotten what justice actually meant. "Just passing through, Sheriff," Ethan replied, his voice calm but his eyes alert. "Thought I might lend a hand with the cleanup." "We don't need any help from drifters," Brennan spat, stopping just close enough to be intimidating. "This is town business. Best you move along before dark." Ethan nodded slowly, but his attention was already elsewhere. Something colorful had caught his eye among the ash and rubble. A splash of red and blue that didn't belong in this monochrome wasteland. As Brennan walked away, muttering under his breath, Ethan knelt down and carefully brushed away the soot. It was a children's cartoon, hand-drawn on what looked like pages torn from a school notebook. The paper was singed around the edges but miraculously intact, depicting a brave little knight rescuing a princess from a tower. But what made Ethan's blood run cold were the words scrawled in a child's handwriting along the margins. "Help me. They took me. Follow the tracks." His hands trembling slightly, Ethan studied the drawing more closely. Hidden within the colorful illustrations were tiny symbols, arrows, numbers, and what looked like a crude map. Someone had deliberately left this here, knowing that the right person would find it. "Thunder," he whispered, folding the cartoon carefully and tucking it inside his vest. "I think we just found ourselves a mystery." As he stood up, movement caught his eye. There, in the soft dirt near the schoolhouse foundation, were footprints, small ones like those of a child, leading away from the ruins toward the edge of town. But these weren't ordinary tracks. They seemed to hesitate, double back on themselves, and then veer off in an entirely different direction, as if the person making them had been confused or frightened. Ethan followed the trail, his experienced eyes reading the story written in the dust. The child had been running. That much was clear. But from what? And why had no one mentioned a missing child? The tracks led him past the burned-out saloon, where a few locals were salvaging what they could from the wreckage. They looked up as he passed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. An elderly woman named Martha Henley, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, watched him with particular intensity. "You looking for something specific, mister?" she called out, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Just trying to understand what happened here," Ethan replied, stopping to face her. "Terrible tragedy. I hope everyone made it out safe." Something flickered in Martha's eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "Everyone who mattered," she said quietly, then turned away as if she'd said too much. The tracks continued past the general store, where the owner, Benjamin Cross, was boarding up what remained of his windows. A thin man with nervous hands and darting eyes, Cross seemed to jump at every sound. "Excuse me," Ethan said, approaching carefully. "I'm trying to piece together what happened the night of the fire. Did you see any children in the area?" Cross's face went pale. Children? No, no children. Why would you ask about children? His voice cracked on the last word, and he fumbled with the hammer in his hands. Just concerned about everyone's safety, Ethan said gently. Sometimes in the chaos of a fire, people get separated from their families. There were no children, Cross repeated firmly, but his eyes told a different story. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. As Ethan walked away, he could feel Cross watching him, and he made a mental note to return when the man might be more willing to talk. The tracks were getting fainter now, but they still led steadily toward the outskirts of town, where the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Near the old water tower, the trail became even more erratic. The footprints circled around and around, as if the child had been lost or trying to hide. Then suddenly, they stopped altogether, disappearing into the hard-packed earth, as if the person making them had simply vanished into thin air. But Ethan's sharp eyes caught something else. Horse tracks, much fresher than the child's footprints, leading away from the spot where the trail ended. Someone on horseback had been here recently, and they'd been in a hurry. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of blood and fire, Ethan made his way back to the center of town. He'd found a room at the only boarding house still standing, run by a widow named Eleanor Vance. A kind woman with sad eyes and gentle hands, she seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare. "You be careful asking questions around here," she warned him as she served him a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. "Some folks don't take kindly to strangers poking around in their business." "What business would that be, ma'am?" Ethan asked, studying her face carefully. Eleanor glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "There's things about this town that ain't right," she whispered. "Things that go back years. That fire. It wasn't the first tragedy we've had, and I fear it won't be the last." "What kind of things?" But before Eleanor could answer, the front door slammed open, and Sheriff Brennan strode in, his face dark with anger. "Mrs. Vance," he said coldly, "I hope you're not filling our guest's head with foolish gossip." "Just making conversation, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, but her voice shook slightly. Brennan's eyes fixed on Ethan. "I thought I told you to move along." "I decided to stay the night," Ethan said calmly. "Hope that's not a problem." "It might be," Brennan replied, his hand moving to his gun. "Depends on what kind of trouble you're planning to cause." Ethan stood slowly, his own hand ready but not threatening. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff. Just trying to help if I can." "We don't need your help," Brennan snarled. "And if I find you snooping around where you don't belong, you'll find yourself in a cell, or worse." After the sheriff left, Eleanor sat down heavily, her face pale. "You should listen to him," she said quietly. "Some secrets are better left buried." But as Ethan lay in his narrow bed that night, the cartoon spread out on the table beside him. He knew he couldn't leave. Somewhere out there, a child was in danger, and he was the only one who seemed to care. The tracks might have vanished, but the trail was far from cold. Tomorrow he would start asking the hard questions. And he had a feeling that before this was over, the truth would prove more dangerous than any fire. Dawn broke gray and cold over Tombstone as Ethan studied the cartoon by lamplight, searching for clues he might have missed. The child's drawing was more sophisticated than it first appeared. The little knight's armor bore intricate details, and the tower in the background had windows that seemed to match the architecture of buildings he'd seen in town. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor Vance stood in the hallway, carrying a tray of coffee and biscuits, her eyes red-rimmed as if she hadn't slept. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray down with trembling hands. "And I need to tell you something." Ethan gestured for her to sit, noting how she kept glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to be watching. "There was a child," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "A little girl named Sarah McKenna. She lived with her aunt, Miss Catherine, in the house behind the schoolhouse, but after the fire—" She trailed off, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What happened to her?" "That's just it. Nobody talks about her anymore. It's like she never existed. But I saw her the day before the fire, playing in the schoolyard, drawing pictures just like that one." Eleanor pointed to the cartoon with a shaking finger. She was always drawing knights and princesses, said she was going to be an artist when she grew up. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Where's her aunt now? Gone. Left town the morning after the fire without a word to anyone. Sheriff Brennan said she was overcome with grief, but Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. I saw her face that morning. It wasn't grief. It was fear. Before Ethan could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the street. Eleanor's face went white as she peered through the curtain. It's them, she gasped. The Hartwell brothers. They work for Mr. Donovan up at the big house. You need to hide that cartoon. Ethan quickly folded the drawing and slipped it inside his vest as heavy boots stomped up the boarding house stairs. 3 men burst through the door without knocking. Twins, Jake and Jesse Hartwell, both built like bulls with mean eyes and scarred knuckles, and their younger brother Tommy, who looked nervous but equally dangerous. Morning, Mrs. Vance, Jake said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We heard you had a guest asking questions about things that ain't his business. I don't know what you mean, Eleanor stammered, but she was backing toward the wall. Jesse stepped closer to Ethan, his hand resting on his gun. See, stranger, Mr. Donovan owns most of this town, and he don't appreciate folks stirring up trouble. Maybe it's time you moved on. I'm just a traveler, Ethan replied calmly, though every muscle in his body was coiled for action. Haven't caused any trouble for anyone. Not yet, Tommy added, his voice high and nervous. But asking questions about fires and missing— Shut up, Tommy, Jake snapped, shooting his brother a warning look. What my baby brother means is, sometimes curiosity can be dangerous, real dangerous. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ethan nodded slowly, appearing to back down, but his mind was racing. The slip about missing confirmed what Eleanor had told him. There was definitely a child involved, and powerful people wanted it kept quiet. After the Hartwell brothers left, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly. I shouldn't have told you, she whispered. Now they'll come for me too. Pack a bag, Ethan said firmly. You're coming with me to visit some friends out of town until this blows over. I can't leave. This is my home. Mrs. Vance, a home isn't worth your life. And something tells me Sarah McKenna's life might depend on people like you having the courage to speak up. An hour later, Ethan was helping Eleanor into a wagon driven by Doc Harrison, an old friend who'd agreed to take her to relatives in Tucson. As they prepared to leave, the doctor pulled Ethan aside. Be careful, son, Doc warned, his weathered face grave. I've been in this town for 20 years, and I've seen what happens to people who cross Donovan. He's got money, power, and no conscience. What's his connection to the fire? Doc glanced around nervously. Can't prove anything, but that schoolhouse was sitting on land he wanted for his new mining operation. Funny how it burned down just when the town council was about to vote against selling it to him. After they left, Ethan decided to investigate the ruins of Catherine McKenna's house. The structure had been completely destroyed, but as he sifted through the debris, he found something interesting. A small metal box, partially melted but still intact. Inside were more drawings, clearly Sarah's work, showing the same knight and princess theme. But these were different, darker. The princess was trapped not in a tower but in what looked like a mine shaft, and the knight was fighting not a dragon, but men in black hats. Looking for something? Ethan spun around to find a young woman watching him from the edge of the property. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything. Despite her simple dress, she carried herself with confidence. I'm Rebecca Walsh, she said, stepping closer. I was Sarah's teacher. Was? Rebecca's face tightened. Before they decided the school didn't need a teacher anymore. Funny how that happened right after I started asking questions about Sarah's disappearance. Ethan studied her carefully. You believe she's still alive? I know she is. Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. This was slipped under my door 2 nights ago. It was another drawing, this one showing the knight following a trail of breadcrumbs through a dark forest. At the bottom, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were the words, "The mine where the sun never shines." There's an old abandoned mine about 5 miles north of town, Rebecca explained. It was closed down years ago after a cave-in. But lately, people have seen lights up there at night. Why haven't you gone to the sheriff? Rebecca laughed bitterly. Brennan? He's in Donovan's pocket. Has been for years. Anyone who tries to investigate anything that might hurt Donovan's business ends up having accidents. As they talked, Ethan noticed movement in the distance, riders approaching fast. We need to go, he said urgently, grabbing Rebecca's arm. But it was too late. The Hartwell brothers came thundering up, their faces dark with anger. Well, well, Jake sneered, dismounting. Look what we got here. The troublemaker and the schoolmarm having a nice little chat. About what? Jesse demanded, his gun already drawn. The weather, Ethan replied calmly, but his hand was inching toward his own weapon. Funny thing about the weather, Tommy said, his nervous energy making him dangerous. Sometimes storms blow in real sudden-like. Sometimes people get caught in them and don't make it home. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ethan could feel Rebecca trembling. Beside him, but to her credit, she stood her ground. You boys seem awfully interested in keeping people from talking, Ethan observed. Makes a man wonder what you're so afraid of. We ain't afraid of nothing, Jake snarled, but his eyes said otherwise. Then you won't mind if I take a ride up to that old mine just to satisfy my curiosity. The effect was immediate. All three brothers went rigid, and Jesse's gun hand twitched. That mine's dangerous, Jesse said quickly. Cave-ins, bad air. Nobody goes up there. Nobody except the people who've been seen carrying supplies up there at night, Rebecca added quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jake smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Ethan had seen all day. Looks like we got ourselves a real problem, Jake said softly. Good thing we know how to solve problems. As the brothers closed in, Ethan knew that the time for questions was over. Whatever was happening in that mine, people were willing to kill to keep it secret. And somewhere in the darkness, a little girl was waiting for someone to be brave enough to find her. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the mountain. All he had to do was stay alive long enough to reach it. The confrontation with the Hartwell brothers ended when Doc Harrison returned unexpectedly, his wagon rattling down the street at full speed. The distraction gave Ethan and Rebecca just enough time to slip away, but not before Jake Hartwell called out a chilling promise. This ain't over, stranger. Not by a long shot. Now, as midnight approached, Ethan and Rebecca crouched behind a boulder overlooking the old Silverback mine. True to Rebecca's word, lights flickered in the darkness below. Not the steady glow of lanterns, but the dancing shadows of people moving with purpose. There, Rebecca whispered, pointing to a narrow trail that wound down the mountainside. That's the only way in or out. If Sarah's down there, she is, Ethan said with quiet certainty. He'd found more evidence that afternoon. Fresh horse tracks leading to the mine, and most damning of all, a child's small shoe print in the mud near the entrance. Question is, how many men are guarding her? Their answer came in the form of voices drifting up from below. Ethan counted at least 4 distinct speakers, including one he recognized as Jesse Hartwell. But it was the 5th voice that made his blood run cold, high, frightened, and unmistakably that of a young girl. Please, the voice pleaded. I want to go home. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Shut up, kid, came a harsh reply. You ain't going nowhere until Mr. Donovan says so. Rebecca gripped Ethan's arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his sleeve. We have to get her out of there, she whispered urgently. We will, Ethan promised. But we need to be smart about it. These men won't hesitate to kill us both if we're caught. They spent the next hour observing the mine's layout and guard patterns. 2 men stayed near the entrance while the others moved deeper into the tunnels. Every 30 minutes, one would emerge to check the perimeter before disappearing back into the darkness. There's something else, Rebecca said as they watched. I've been thinking about what Doc Harrison said, about Donovan wanting the schoolhouse land for mining. What if this isn't just about keeping Sarah quiet? What if she saw something the night of the fire? Ethan nodded grimly. Something that could prove the fire wasn't an accident. Exactly. And if Donovan's planning to expand his mining operation, he'd need to eliminate any witnesses who could connect him to arson. A new voice echoed from the mine entrance, and both watchers tensed. It was Donovan himself, his cultured Eastern accent cutting through the night air like a blade. "Gentlemen," Donovan said as he approached the guards, "I trust our young guest is being properly cared for." "She's fine, boss," one of the guards replied. "Scared, but fine." "Good, because tomorrow we're going to have a little accident, a tragic cave-in that will solve all our problems permanently." Rebecca gasped, and Ethan had to clamp his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. They were planning to murder Sarah and make it look like an accident. "What about the drifter?" Jesse Hartwell's voice carried clearly in the still air. "He's been asking too many questions." "Mr. Carter will meet with his own unfortunate accident tonight," Donovan replied coldly. "I've already sent Jake and Tommy to the boarding house. By morning, both problems will be eliminated." Ethan's mind raced. They had to act now, not just to save Sarah, but to prevent his own murder. But first, he needed to get Rebecca to safety. "Listen to me," he whispered urgently. "I want you to ride back to town and find Doc Harrison. Tell him what we've heard and have him get word to the territorial marshal in Phoenix. This is bigger than just a kidnapping. It's conspiracy and murder." "I'm not leaving you," Rebecca protested. "You have to. If something happens to me, you're the only one who knows the truth. Sarah's life depends on someone getting help." Reluctantly, Rebecca agreed, but not before pressing something into his hand, a small derringer she'd been carrying in her bag. "It only has 2 shots, she warned. "Make them count." After Rebecca disappeared into the darkness, Ethan began his descent toward the mine. The trail was treacherous in the moonlight, loose rocks threatening to send him tumbling with every step. But years of tracking through hostile territory had taught him to move like a ghost when necessary. The first guard never knew what hit him. Ethan's arms snaked around the man's throat from behind, cutting off his air until he slumped unconscious. The second guard was more alert, but a well-placed rock to the head solved that problem. Inside the mine, the darkness was absolute. Ethan felt his way along the rough-hewn walls, following the sound of voices deeper into the tunnels. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of fear and desperation. "Sarah?" he called softly when he was sure he was close. "Who's there?" came the frightened response. "Please don't hurt me anymore. My name's Ethan, sweetheart. I'm here to take you home." He found her in a small chamber about 50 feet from the entrance, her hands and feet bound with rope. Even in the dim light of a single candle, he could see she'd been crying. But her eyes blazed with the same fierce intelligence he'd seen in her drawings. "Are you really going to help me?" she whispered as he cut her bonds. "I promise," he said gently, "but we need to be very quiet. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded bravely, and Ethan felt his heart clench. She couldn't be more than 8 years old, but she'd endured more terror in the past few days than most adults faced in a lifetime. They were halfway to the entrance when footsteps echoed from the main tunnel. Ethan pushed Sarah behind a support beam and drew his gun just as Jesse Hartwell appeared, lantern in one hand, pistol in the other. "Well, well," Jesse sneered. "Look what we got here. The hero comes to save the day." "Let her go, Hartwell," Ethan said calmly. "She's just a child." "That child saw my brother Jake setting fire to the schoolhouse," Jesse replied. "She can identify him, which means she can bring down Mr. Donovan's whole operation. Can't have that." "So you kidnapped her instead of just leaving town?" Jesse laughed harshly. "Leave town? This is our town now. Donovan's got plans, big plans, and nobody's gonna stop them, especially not some drifter with a hero complex." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Ethan could hear more footsteps approaching from deeper in the mine, reinforcements that would make escape impossible. "Sarah," he whispered without taking his eyes off Jesse. "When I say run, you head for that entrance as fast as you can. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "I'm scared," she whimpered. "I know, sweetheart, but you're braver than you know. Remember your drawings? You're the princess who saves herself." Jesse was raising his gun when Ethan made his move. He dove to the side, firing the derringer as he rolled. The shot took Jesse in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his lantern crashing to the ground. "Run!" Ethan shouted. Sarah bolted for the entrance like a frightened rabbit as the mine plunged into darkness. Ethan heard Jesse cursing and scrambling for his dropped gun, while the approaching footsteps turned into a full run. Using the darkness to his advantage, Ethan felt his way toward the entrance, guided by the faint moonlight filtering in from outside. Behind him, angry voices shouted orders and accusations as the men stumbled around in the blackness. He emerged from the mine to find Sarah waiting by the horses, tears streaming down her face, but her chin set with determination. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. "I drew it in my pictures." As they rode away from the mine, Ethan could hear the sounds of pursuit beginning behind them. But they had a head start, and he knew these mountains better than most. More importantly, they had the truth, and sometimes the truth was the most powerful weapon of all. The race for justice had begun, and Ethan intended to win it. Dawn was breaking over Tombstone as Ethan and Sarah rode hard toward town, the thunder of pursuing horses echoing behind them. Sarah clung to him tightly, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear, but her spirit remained unbroken. "They're gaining on us," she said, looking back at the dust cloud rising in the distance. "Not for long," Ethan replied grimly. He'd been saving Thunder's strength for this moment, and now he gave the horse his head. The powerful Mustang surged forward, his hooves eating up the ground with desperate speed. But as they crested the hill overlooking Tombstone, Ethan's heart sank. Smoke was rising from the center of town, not the black smoke of another fire, but the gray smoke of many chimneys. The entire population seemed to be gathered in the town square, and at the center of the crowd stood a gallows that hadn't been there the day before. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. Before Ethan could answer, a rifle shot cracked across the morning air. The bullet whistled past his ear, close enough to part his hair. The Hartwell brothers had caught up, and they weren't interested in taking prisoners. Ethan spurred Thunder toward the town, weaving between rocks and scrub brush as more shots rang out behind them. His only hope was to reach the crowd before the brothers could finish what they'd started. As they thundered down Main Street, people scattered like startled chickens. Sheriff Brennan stood on the gallows platform, his face a mask of fury and desperation. Beside him, looking perfectly composed despite the chaos, stood Donovan himself, a tall, elegant man in an expensive suit that seemed wildly out of place in the frontier town. "Stop right there!" Brennan shouted, drawing his gun. "You're under arrest for kidnapping and murder!" Ethan pulled Thunder to a sliding stop in front of the platform, Sarah still clinging to his back. "Whose murder would that be, Sheriff?" "Doc Harrison," Brennan replied with a cold smile. "Found him shot dead in his office this morning. Funny thing, witnesses saw you talking to him yesterday." The crowd murmured angrily, but Ethan noticed that many faces showed confusion rather than conviction. These people weren't sure what to believe, and that gave him hope. "That's a lie," called a voice from the crowd. Rebecca Walsh pushed through the gathered townspeople, her face flushed with anger and determination. "Doc Harrison isn't dead. He's right here." The crowd parted to reveal the elderly doctor, very much alive and accompanied by 3 men wearing territorial marshal badges. The lead marshal, a grizzled veteran named Sam Crawford, stepped forward with his hand on his gun. "Mr. Donovan," Crawford said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, arson, and attempted murder." Donovan's composure finally cracked. "This is preposterous. I'm a respected businessman. You can't possibly believe the word of a drifter and a hysterical school teacher. How about the word of an 8-year-old girl who saw your men burn down the schoolhouse?" Crawford replied. He looked up at Sarah, who was still perched behind Ethan on Thunder's back. "Hello, Miss McKenna. We've been looking for you." Sarah slid down from the horse and walked bravely toward the platform, her small chin raised defiantly. "I saw them," she said in a clear, strong voice that carried across the silent square. Jake and Mr. Jesse poured something on the schoolhouse and lit it on fire. Then they saw me watching from my window, and they came after me." "That's impossible," Brennan sputtered. "The child is obviously traumatized and confused." "The child," interrupted Doc Harrison, "has been hidden in my root cellar for the past 2 days, telling her story to Marshal Crawford here. We've been waiting for the right moment to spring our trap." Ethan felt a surge of admiration for the old doctor's cunning. While he'd been playing the hero, Doc had been playing chess, using Sarah's rescue as bait to draw out all the conspirators. "You see," Crawford continued, "Miss Walsh here brought us some very interesting evidence last night." He held up Sarah's cartoon, now carefully preserved between sheets of glass. "This drawing shows remarkable detail about the mine operation, detail that only someone who'd been held there could know." Donovan's face had gone pale, but he wasn't finished fighting. "Even if this fantasy were true, you have no proof that I was involved. I'm a victim here. My employees acting without my knowledge or consent." "Actually," said a new voice from the crowd, "we have plenty of proof." Eleanor Vance stepped forward, no longer the frightened widow, but a woman with fire in her eyes. In her hands was a leather satchel that she held up for all to see. "I've been keeping records," she announced. "Every bribe, every threat, every accident that's happened in this town for the past 5 years, it's all written down with dates and witnesses." "You have no right," Donovan began, but Eleanor cut him off. "I had every right. My husband was one of your victims, Mr. Donovan. He died in that cave-in at your mine because he threatened to report the unsafe working conditions. I've been waiting 5 years for the chance to see justice done." The crowd was murmuring now, anger building like a storm. Ethan could see the tide turning as people began to remember their own grievances, their own losses that had been dismissed as accidents or bad luck. Sheriff Brennan, seeing which way the wind was blowing, tried to slip away from the platform. But Tommy Hartwell, the youngest and most frightened of the brothers, suddenly broke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he cried out, his voice cracking with panic. "We were just supposed to scare people, make them sell their land. But then the girl saw us and Donovan said we had to keep her quiet, and then the drifter started asking questions." "Shut up, you fool," Jake Hartwell snarled. But it was too late. The confession was out, and the crowd's anger was reaching a boiling point. Marshal Crawford raised his hand for silence. "That's enough evidence for me. Jake Hartwell, Jesse Hartwell, Thomas Hartwell, Marcus Brennan, and Vincent Donovan, you're all under arrest." The next few minutes were chaos as the marshals moved to arrest the conspirators. Jake and Jesse tried to fight their way out, but the angry crowd wasn't about to let them escape. Donovan maintained his dignity to the end, but his empire of fear and corruption was crumbling around him. As the dust settled, Sarah ran to Ethan and threw her arms around his waist. "Thank you," she whispered. "You kept your promise." "We all did, sweetheart," he replied, ruffling her hair gently. "Sometimes it takes a whole town to set things right." Rebecca approached them, her eyes shining with tears of relief and gratitude. "What will you do now?" she asked. Ethan looked around at the town that was already beginning to heal. People were talking to each other again, sharing their stories and their pain. Children were playing in the streets, no longer afraid of shadows and whispers. "I think I might stick around for a while," he said slowly. "This town's going to need help rebuilding, and Sarah's going to need someone to look after her until her aunt comes back." "If she comes back," Rebecca said softly. "She will," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "I drew a picture of it last night. She's coming home next week with a new husband and a baby on the way. They're going to adopt me officially and open a new school." Ethan and Rebecca exchanged amazed glances. The child's drawings had been prophetic so far. Who were they to doubt her now? As the sun climbed higher over Tombstone, washing away the shadows of fear and corruption, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. He'd come to this town as a drifter, with nothing but painful memories and a guilty conscience. But he was leaving, or rather staying, as something more. He was home. And for the first time in his 44 years, that felt like exactly where he belonged. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often. Come.